Hello, and welcome to Coach Talk, the show more interested in ideas and philosophy than facts and history. My guest this week is Duffman. He's a 12-time European champion who's just come off an unprecedented, undefeated year as the assistant coach of G2 Esports. We talked about the fundamentals of League, how to approach new changes in the game, and how he scouts for opponents. Duffman has a democratic, soft, and precise approach to coaching. He's often not as forward facing as other coaches, but has been a crucial part of many of the best European teams of all time. It was a fantastic conversation, and I learned a lot from it. So, without further ado, Duffman, what is coaching?
This is something I've been trying to work out myself this year, I guess. I think mostly coaching just comes down to like setting expectations, either with a group or an individual, on how you're going to progress and then holding them accountable to that. I think that's kind of the approach I've taken. I've taken the more I guess, uh democratic approach where we're part of the process together, but there's also like the other approach of being like a coach setting the expectation solo and then making sure everyone's held to that. But that's the gist of how I've been trying to approach it.
And when you say expectations, do you mean specifically around performance, around everything, or how do you find that?
Um, I think for a coach, primarily around performance, I think you can go into the other realms of like how you're going to structure your day and all of this stuff. But I think primarily the coaching part of it is performance related, at least in how I see it, I guess.
And you've had multiple different roles over the years. I mean, even just at
Yeah.
G2, covering a lot of different positions. Was this mostly a case of kind of doing the same thing but being called whatever was needed at the time, or were they really distinct different roles?
So, I mean, the general way I approached any role I went into, I was given a lot of freedom because I came in at like the very start of LoL esports. So, very much people were looking for people, but they weren't entirely sure what they wanted for them. So, always I just try and fit whatever the team needs at any given time. But generally, I started out as like a remote analyst, moved in house eventually, but that was more as like I came in as the manager of G2 at that time, where I was still trying to balance being an analyst. Then I moved more into like scouting as I got more used to how our team wanted to talk about the game and kind of transplanting that onto what other teams are going to do to us. So I moved into scouting from there. Then I kind of moved back again to being being a scout, dropping the managerial stuff, and then focusing more on providing data as a head analyst. And then recently, in the last few years, I've moved more away from the analytical side and into like straight coaching, I guess.
And what's been your favorite, if you don't mind me asking?
Um, so my favorite in terms of like where I felt most useful would probably, funnily enough, be like 2016, 17, when the way the old client used to work, you used to be able to track um, what masteries and runes people were using. So I was making a program that could track what people were doing, and teams scrimmed on live server, so I could track what teams were scrimming essentially. So in terms of like the effect I had, I think that was probably the most OP my position could be. But I think the last year has been the most rewarding for me in terms of seeing my ideas go out into the game. And I think that's probably my favorite part of the job is just when I can have impact on what the players are doing. So I think
Mm,
that's been my favorite year so far.
great. You mentioned there, how, getting used to how we talk about the game. How
Mhm.
important do you think that is to build up kind of your own understanding of it? Because especially now with so many analysts and coaches doing a lot of very public things,
Mhm.
people hear all these words, tempo or like how we play with side lanes or whatever it might be a lot. How
Yeah.
important is it to find what they actually mean for you and your team specifically? Or do you actually think that we're kind of close enough everyone understands the same thing?
Um, I think so. Like that kind of mindset comes from when I first came into a gaming house. I was just pretty useless, right? I was a remote analyst. I'd never really been like in a team environment. I'd never played at a high level myself, so I was out of my depth and I had to learn. So I learned just by listening what we were talking about, and from there I kind of got my feeling was that that's like the most important thing, is to make sure that everyone is able to put words to what we're doing in games, and that does come down to like the words like tempo and like side laning and trying to put concepts to everything. So yeah, I think now my general view is my job is to like build sort of a vocabulary around all of the things we want to do in game, all of the concepts we want to build, so that when it comes to games, we talk about it as if it's just like a very normal thing, instead of some very specific having to go into micro details and have people telling people exactly where to be. So I think that's like the most important thing for my role.
Yeah, I love that. You get to be able to communicate a lot more information quickly, but also if you can't actually talk about something, it's very difficult to get better at it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's the most important thing for me. I think when I, like, for example, I came into G2 this year, and none of the concepts I was introducing are like brand new things. It was just I was putting words to them. I was giving a structure that was very easy to kind of move around. So if we needed to change something, it was very clear what needed to change, instead of something's going wrong. I don't know what's going wrong. I don't know how to speak about it, but it's going wrong. So I think that's like my main goal when I go into a team, is to try and like build sort of our language of how we see the game, because it's always much easier once everyone starts at the same place. Then you can build on it a lot easier.
And how do you go about doing that? Like kind of in a day to day, do you already come in with a lot of words that you know you want to use? Or
Mm.
is it a case of when it comes up in a review, let's now discuss it? Like, how do you approach that?
It's a bit of both. I think I came into this year with a lot of concepts that I wanted to apply from watching G2 last year. I think part of wanting to join G2 was I'd seen areas I think I could help. So a lot of it was kind of pre-decided. But then a lot of it is day to day, where something will come up in a game and I'll go, okay, this happens a lot. Like we need to talk about like what this means and how do we put words to this to make sure next time it happens, we just say the thing, basically.
Mm. And then, like you mentioned, with this democratic approach, you get to get the idea from everyone, but then you can enforce it in terms of right. We've now all agreed that we're going to do this,
Yeah.
rather than you just coming in and saying we have to do this thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's like I present how I see the situation, we talk about it, and then we kind of lock it in as like this is how we're going to move forward, and then it comes down to consistency of me using those same words over and over.
You mentioned before that you, as a coach, you've never played like competitively. I'm the same as well. Have you found that to be a bit of a struggle, especially when you're doing so many things that are so specific about the game, where it's like,
Um,
okay, you know,
yeah, I think for me, I've been around for so long that as I move into like the coaching side, I think I built up a bit of like, I don't know, just people assume I know something. So I think that really helps. I've also been lucky to be in teams where I've been a part of the group for a long time or met friends with members of the team. So it's not been a case of me having to prove myself. But for sure, if I had gone straight into coaching in the beginning, it would have been very tough because I just wouldn't have kind of the credibility to just enforce things. So it would be more on just how much trust the players are willing to put on without me actually proving anything. So I think that's for sure a big part of it. I think for me, I've taken the slow approach of kind of building up to where I am. So I think it's not so much of a problem for me as I move into coaching.
hmm. Yeah, I love that. And I love it ties back to what you said right at the beginning in terms of the expectations, where if
Mhm.
you're just there to build the expectations of, okay, we said we would talk about this in this way and do it in this way, then suddenly
Yeah,
it's not about how much you know or about the fact that you could be challenger if you wanted or whatever that might be. It can
yeah,
just be a much more of a group thing.
yeah, exactly. I try not to dictate too much. I think if I'd played more and I could back up my kind of opinions with that, I think I could be more dictatorial. But for me, it's more, I just want to see my ideas and how they survive the game. So it's more putting it out there and working together to see how we actually use these things.
If you had that as an option to be more dictatorial, to be more vertical,
Mhm.
would you take that more frequently, or is it just a case of finding right situation for the right approach? Or
Mm. I think that just doesn't suit my personality. I think even when I was a manager, I'm not the personality that's going to do that and then also back it up when there's like pushback. I'm very much just, I want to have a conversation and work on these things together. I think there are cases where you get to situations in game where you kind of need to put your foot down and be like, okay, I can see your point of view, but we really need to do this for this specific reason. I think there are cases when that happens, but they're quite rare with me, I would say. I'm just not, that's not how I can communicate. I can't go one on one with a player like that, basically, would
Mm.
be how I would say it.
Yeah, I think that's really astute. And I think it's great advice for any coaches listening to this. I think it's useful to maybe have some tools in both cases. You know, if you
Yeah.
normally suit the vertical way, have some tools, work out how to, work on your active listening and that kind of thing, and vice versa, work on how you could be
Mhm.
a bit more vertical. But definitely astute to be able to reflect and say, okay, that's not me, that's not my personality. So you're never going to be as productive.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, I'll give a bit of kind of background for this question because it does tie into what we're talking about. But you made a video at one point with BDS talking about
Hmm.
things you can do in Clash to level up your team play. And you used the example of Astralis, I think it was, who at that point were just always playing like mid and side prio, crash 3 waves, go and dive on the side,
Yeah.
like every single game, rinse and repeat. But I think actually maybe even the year after that, the minion wave timings changed completely,
Yeah.
specifically to avoid that situation. So how do you approach something like that completely new with the idea of what we're discussing of, okay, in the end, we're going to build up this vocabulary, we're going to have words of how we might approach it. But in terms of once they announce the change, day one, and then
Mhm.
throughout, how do you approach something completely new in the game?
Okay, so something like that. I think an easier, like a more like direct example I could use would be when they introduced grubs this year. I think that's where I really had to do this process where, I mean, first I had to sit down and really think about like what happens when this is the most important thing in the game, when this is all the game is focused on. So I would look at like the previous year we had heralds. So I'm thinking, okay, when you have herald at 8 minutes, everyone eventually towards the end of the year came 8 minutes, most important timer. Jungler has to be 6. Support started playing for 6. And that influences what happens. That means less roaming support. It means less windows for junglers to gank. So okay, you take away that timer, you move it to 6 minutes, you move it to grubs, and now suddenly support can never be level 6 for then. So now supports don't have that pressure. They can roam more. They can influence the game a lot more earlier, which can mean your jungler can start maybe stealing camps so that they are getting 6 for grubs. So it's like that's the kind of process I go to when I joined G2 and these changes came in. I pretty much just, yeah, I went through like the thought process. This is what's changed. This is what we used to have to do, but now this is the kind of new state of things. And then exploring, okay, if this 6 minute thing is the most important thing in the game now, what does this mean? This means less windows to play for Drake. This means if you want to play for Drake, you have to do it specifically like between 5:30, or you're just not going to be in time. So now we need to start thinking, okay, if we're not in time, what else should we be doing? We need to be diving bot, and we need to be thinking about the game this way. So when things change like that, I think it's really just taking it to as concrete kind of this is the most important thing in the game and seeing how that looks, and then kind of zooming out from there and taking it more generally afterwards.
Yeah, and it seems from the way you're talking there, it's like you're comparing it to the current system that you have for the game. And so
Yeah.
again, making it's so obvious that it's so important to have that kind of concrete system and that concrete way of thinking about things, because when
Mhm.
something changes, if it's all, we all say tempo and we all mean something slightly different, then you're not
Mm.
sure how it's going to change the tempo of the game.
Yeah, exactly. I also think like teams do stuff for reasons. So when all the teams kind of converge on a similar idea, even if it's not optimal, but they agree, like in every game, it became the thing. Like 8 minutes, you had to prepare for that. That was your draft. You talked about how does this work at Herald? What do we want to do? So if you start from there, you've already shortcutted a lot of the like problems teams had getting there. If you start out with this is what we did, so what does this mean for us now? What problems did we have with the Herald situation? And okay, now some of them might not be problems anymore. They might be advantages, like supports having more free time, for example.
And what happens? So you've done that as prep, let's say, and then what happens if you come into the games and you were wrong about saying, okay, let's just assume they're the really important objective, and then we do this and this. Because I mean, I
Hmm.
think I wasn't coaching this year, so I might be wrong about the details of this, but they did have to buff grubs a bit before they became
Yeah.
now the most important thing. So how do you come to? So that's your kind of pre planning. Then the first day of grubs hitting, you start
Hmm.
playing as if they're really really strong. How do you assess whether this is right or not, or is it, because that's always the question, right? Is this the
Yeah.
right plan and misexecution, or is it the wrong plan and any execution wouldn't have mattered?
Yeah. I think so. In this case, for example, I just came in with the mindset like, okay, they've introduced this new thing. This is a very big like change for them. This isn't something they're going to put in and then throw away in a patch. So even if it's not the strongest thing right now, they're going to make sure it is. This is something they're going to buff if this is a problem. So that kind of alleviated the pressure of, okay, we might be wasting our time focusing on this so much. But I also think a lot of these things are like, I try not to focus on the specific grubs.
Mm,
Focus more on the specific, this is a top side objective and how we play for top side objectives, because those lessons tend to apply a lot more broadly. And then Drake's, you have bot side objectives, and like then you're talking, rather than talking about grubs versus Drake, you're talking about a top side objective versus a bot side one, and how to balance that, how to set up for them, and kind of taking the more general lesson
mm,
rather than the specifics, I
mm.
think.
Yeah, I really like that. I think we get too kind of caught in the specific details, but
Yeah.
actually, the underlying systems of how you control an area is going to be the same depending on. It doesn't matter if the thing that's in the area changes. Like Baron's in the same
Yeah.
pit, so you're doing both at once.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of how I see it.
And I don't know if you've paid attention to the announcements for next year,
Hmm.
but they talked as well about a multiplayer practice tool. Now, for someone like me, that I
Yeah.
think that's incredibly exciting. Do you think this
Yeah.
aids in the process? How do you imagine actually making use of that in the day to day? Obviously, we have no idea how it's going to work, if it's going to work. But if we
Yeah.
just assume it's like it is now, but with 10 players in, is this something that would speed up this process, in your opinion?
Yeah, for sure. I think right now, the way we have to practice, or the way we have evolved how we practice, is it's just painful. I think having to play an entire game from start to finish, I think is just very painful. It really makes specific things hard to work on. And it makes it so that you can only really work on like a few things at once. If you start trying to work on everything at once, you really end up just kind of practicing nothing, because half the situations don't even come up in games. So I think having a space where you can just get together in a game, even after a full scrim, just being able to go back, set up that scenario, and be like, okay, this is exactly where we need to be clicking. This is exactly, you need to be here. You need to stay here for this reason. I think being able to do that is going to be huge if that's how it works, right? And I'm still not sure of the entire details, but anything that can allow us to set up scenarios a lot better will help
Mm,
massively.
mm. Yeah, that's the big thing. I was talking about it with someone recently, and they were very skeptical about how useful it would be, and What if it's just
Hmm.
the same as it is now? So you have to keep spamming 30 seconds forward and all that kind of thing. And
Yeah,
you can't choose towers, you can't choose positions. But my thing was like, okay, even if that's what it is, it's still better than not having it. There still might be like
yeah,
one case every week where we can use it to save some time. And even that's just
exactly,
better than nothing.
exactly. And sometimes like you don't even need to necessarily set up the map to do these things. If you're just talking about how you take control of
Mm.
Drake, where you want your wards, where you want people to stand with specific champs, like you don't even need those champs. You just need 5 people in the game, just so they can kind of actually see it. It's one thing talking about stuff on a whiteboard and just putting dots in places and being like, you be here. But it's another being like, okay, you're here. This is why. You can see exactly why you are here. So next time they go into the game, that's like the actual image they have in their head rather than just a pin in a whiteboard.
Mm. And scrims, of course, end up being incredibly snowbally. So
Yeah.
even just the idea of finding different big areas of the game that we can come into with a more even state. The example that I gave at one point was actually against you guys in the
Mhm.
first split of the LEC. In all our preseason at Excel and our so sometime in December and then all of January or whatever it was, we'd never had a scrim that went over 35 minutes. And in one of
Yeah.
our first weekend game played against you guys, it went over 35 minutes and we made some horrendous decisions. And so
Yeah.
even if we could just start at 20 minutes with the average goal the top laner has, the average goal the support has, whatever that might be, even that would be useful, I think.
Yeah, that would be massively useful, I think. I think just being able to remove, especially the emotion of the first 20 minutes of the game. I think there's a lot of, whether you want it or not, there's a lot of ego involved in playing this game. So when you're losing, you might not necessarily feel like you're going into 20 minutes in the same situation as if you're even a little bit ahead. And I think even just being able to remove that would be huge for just making effective practice.
Yeah, true. And also, even forgetting the emotion that you're bringing from the earlier stages of the game, the more it
Hmm.
looks like practice and the less it looks like a game, the less it's like annoying if you lose to the opponent. Because we
Yeah.
also have to practice against people we know on the other team we don't want to lose to. It doesn't matter if it's technically just a scrim or anything like that. So the more it becomes practice, maybe just makes a lot of things easier.
No, I think so. Yeah, that really makes sense. I think for sure if you remove nameplates, things get much easier. And then the next step from that is removing the expectation. Like if we win or lose this, we're going to be judged and we're going to judge ourselves.
Hmm. Is that something that you make an effort to do now, even with the current scrim system? And if so, how do you go about it?
I try and kind of preach that like we're here to practice. I think that's the hardest thing to do sometimes when, because it all comes down to again expectations. When you think you're really good and you start losing to teams that you don't think you should be losing to, you start to think about things differently, and it can be hard. I try to like, yeah, I try to be consistent. Like I don't really care about the result. It's more about what we're doing. But obviously that's hard. That depends on the group of players and the atmosphere you have. You have to kind of just keep pushing the narrative, I guess.
Hmm. One of the things you mentioned before, I think it was at well, many times, but the one that stuck out to me was around an interview at Worlds talking about the fundamentals. And a lot of
Mm.
Eastern teams maybe actually, we think of them as kind of unbeatable, never make any mistakes, but actually they have some problems in the fundamentals of the game as well. What would you describe as the fundamentals of League? Because just like the tempo thing before, I think when
Yeah.
each coach says fundamentals means different things. I've heard, even just over the last few years, working with a lot of different coaches, I've heard complete opposite ends of the spectrum. Fundamentals being purely about the simplest team stuff, or
Mhm.
fundamentals being actually purely about the simplest individual stuff with nothing to do with the team. So, what are the fundamentals of the game?
Yeah. So for me, I'm not I'm not used to coaching on like an individual basis. So my fundamentals are very team based. And basically my fundamentals are just come down to the waves and then all of the kind of like logic that comes from the waves, because that's the like main constant in every game throughout the game. So you have waves like, okay, now they're gonna move out of sync a bit again. I think. But for this year, for example, you had your waves meeting 27 or 30 seconds, like close enough even that they don't impact each other too much. So then the logic from there is okay, so if you catch a wave in the middle and then push it out, you're going to use X amount of time and then you're going to base, which means you're going to miss the next wave so you can play on the next wave. And it's kind of following these thought processes through and making sure that the way we play the game kind of matches these structures that are kind of imposed, because these things are not going to change. If you take a wave deep, you're going to return at like basically if you base at the same time in two different scenarios, you're going to get the same effect. You're going to arrive at the same time on the same wave every time. So it's playing with kind of these fundamental rules of the game. So trying to like then build structures and concepts around that. So for example, if you base on a wave, you're going to skip a wave and then you're going to be back for the next one. So you can already start planning for that wave 1 minute ahead, what you need to be doing. You know what state that wave will be based on when you based. If you base late, you know you're going to also miss that wave a minute ahead, so you can already plan for that. And it's trying to make sure that we are aware of the decisions we're making and what that means for the next minute, essentially.
Mm.
I think
So
that's probably not the best description I've given of that, but yeah, it comes down to the waves and then the logic puzzles that kind of evolve from there.
So it's like the fundamentals is getting us all on that same timing so that we're all aware of how the game is progressing forward.
Yeah, it's being aware together, and it's also being aware of what decisions you're making for other people with what you're doing. Like if you're planning to go mid, but you're also basing late, then there's kind of no point in planning for that play because you're just going to be late to it. Regardless of if you have tempo or not, you're just going to be late. So it's then already changing the plan there. So I think there's a lot of situations in the game that can be simplified just by looking at the waves and the state of them, essentially.
Mm. Okay. One of the things that I think is always really interesting with talking to people who have very specific kind of systems and models for the game is how complex or how simple you make them and kind of finding that balance. Because you
Yeah.
mentioned there, like you could be kind of thinking about the timing of every single wave. Is that something that you suggest for teams? Like we should be making a plan for every wave that's happening, or do we identify key moments, or is it kind of a balance where it's like, okay, maybe not every wave, but every fifth wave, or is there some kind of yeah? It's like how do you find the fact if you have a system that
Yeah.
covers absolutely every situation in a game with this many variables, it's going to be ridiculously complicated. If you have one that
Yeah.
covers not enough, then it's not going to be useful. So how do you find the balance?
So the way I work is with triggers, basically. So it's not necessarily setting everything up ahead of time. It's more, okay, we are basing now. What options do we have because of that? Or it's, okay, they have tempo. Their tempo is topside. So what do we do? Do we match that or do we go the other side? It's more about sort of reactionary to what's happening in the game rather than necessarily planning things out ahead of time. And I think that kind of simplifies it a bit. So it's more about reacting to what's happening in the game rather than necessarily having 20 different unique situations every game. It's trying to get to like, this happens, what is our response? Because this is the thing that's going to happen over and over and over in games.
Mm. Yeah, there's a quote from Steve Hansen, who's used to be the coach of the All Blacks when they were one of the best sports teams of all time. And he said,
Mhm.
your job as a coach is to make it as simple as possible. But the
Yeah.
thing for me is always like that as possible can be a bit flexible.
Yeah,
And
that's very vague. Yeah.
yeah, and it gives you enough wiggle room to get out of any situation. But also that
Yeah.
means it should flex depending on the people, right? Like you work with the best players in Europe, therefore it can be more complicated. If someone's listening to this as a ERL2 coach or working with a bunch of rookies, okay, maybe you have to make it a bit more simple because
Yeah.
you know you get rid of some of the triggers and you have only bigger ones or whatever that might be.
Yeah, exactly. I think I've definitely benefited from working with a lot of very high performing players. I think players that can take care of a lot more stuff on their own. So there's a lot more space for me to put a lot more on them. And yeah, I think even then, I would say it's still about making it simple. I think there are cases where you try and introduce something and like it makes logical sense. It's just when it comes to it, it's just there's too many other variables to be thinking about in a game that they can't really latch on to that specific thing.
So in those cases, if you're gradually starting to introduce something and you see it's kind of not latching on, or maybe it's just not, I mean, worth the effort is maybe a terrible phrase, but I think I think you know what I mean, where
Yeah,
it's not worth
I
the
know what you
extra
mean.
cognitive load. Is it something where you're okay just trying that and then just pulling it back if need be, or do you try and have a guess beforehand?
Yeah, I think a very kind of receptive to just like what's happening naturally. I don't try and like force things too much. I think especially with like G2 this year, for example, it's like we're a very natural team where we kind of play in the moment a lot. So I couldn't, I didn't want to put too much like this is something we have to do no matter what. It's more if it fits with kind of how we talk and how we play the game, then good. If it doesn't, I'm not going to force it too much. I think a lot of times if it is too difficult to do, I think then I would go back and I would look deeper, like, okay, maybe this isn't like the actual fundamental part of the problem. Maybe this is just like the symptom of the problem, I guess, and try and find out if there's like more that I'm not actually considering. Because yeah, if we can't actually talk about it or recognize it in the games, then it's probably not the actual thing that's happening.
This might be an impossible question without kind of concrete examples to have right to hand, but how do you try and differentiate when it's a a symptom and when it's the actual problem? And how do you find out when you're going deep enough, I guess?
Um, I think well, I'm very much just about the feeling. Like in G2, we were like the guys were very quick to pick up on everything. So if there's something that we're just not picking up, then there must be something else going on, essentially. Like it's not for lack of trying that this thing isn't working. So we're gonna drop that. I'm gonna go workshop it essentially and try to get deeper. And if not, if I can't come to a solution on that, or if there's other things that need worked on, then we're just gonna shelve it, right? I think it's kind of a case by case basis, but it's more about feeling, I think, than anything. It just depends on the group of players, what they can apply and what they can make use of. So if we last year weren't able to implement something, there's got to be a reason to it.
Okay. One of the other things I think is really an interesting challenge for coaching in a game like League of Legends is because there's so many things to focus on, like we talked about before. Teams, I feel like almost always, I'm sure there might be examples where this has not happened, but it's like when we focus on mid game, our early game gets a little bit weaker, or when we
Yeah,
focus on late game, then our mid game gets a bit weaker. For example, I mean, G2 in the year before you would get massive gold leads, but then the mid game was maybe a bit more ropey. And then last year, you guys were amazing in the mid stages of the game, and it was felt like in the LEC, no matter the gold situation, it was still like at best 50-50. Um,
yeah.
so how do you decide on what area of the game to focus on? Do you think, for example, okay, mid game is just the most important, therefore we focus on it, or does it depend on the situation? Does it depend on the team, and how do you find those variables if it does?
Um, I think it does come down to what you practice. I think last year a lot of G2's effort was put into like making the openings of games very good. So they always had very clear, this is going to happen, and then if this goes wrong, we do this because they've drilled it so much. But with the way we have to practice playing through full games, if you want to spend your energy and efforts in review and in talking about the game, talking about later stages of the game, you don't have space to make sure the early game is as concrete as it needs to be. And I think that's really the main cause. I think this has been a thing plaguing teams since the start of League of Legends, where you say, okay, we're going to work on Barons this week, and then everything else just falls apart. Like inexplicably, you're just not being as careful as possible around every stage of the game before then. So there are going to be mistakes that happen, and I think that's like the main thing. When you go on stage, this is a very easy game to lose and to make mistakes if you're not absolutely crisp on every detail. So there's a lot of areas where just one thing goes wrong and then that cascades. I think it's not necessarily a case of mid game being most important. I think there's no simplifying it down to like what stage is more important. I think it's all like equally important. But yeah, it really comes down to what you practice. And it's just very difficult to practice everything at the same time with the same level of intensity without really just blowing up as a team, because then you're just looking at like 40 things that went wrong that game instead of, okay, this is what we want to improve at.
And also, it starts to impact how you might play out the early stages of the game. If you know that you're really, really solid in how you're going to play the mid game, then you don't need to be as aggressive in the early game. And so it's like if early game was the focus, you would actually change how you were playing as well as just what you were good at.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a part of it. Like last year, I think if you give G2, like 2023, if you give G2 an early game lead, they're going to be very happy. They're going to just run away with the game. But as soon as those games go sort of even into mid game, then they don't have all the answers. Whereas this year, it was almost the opposite, where it didn't matter how we went into mid game, we had answers, but we would not have all the answers just starting from level 1. So then, yeah, you're not playing the game out the same way you would if you kind of knew exactly what you needed to be doing.
And do you think that's more a better recipe for success when it comes to international competition, especially because we have seen teams who have been, well, including G2, who've been very dominant early game in Western competition, and then in international competition, it's like, okay, if you do get a massive lead, then you can still close the game out, but you're less likely to get a lead. Whereas you guys, I mean, I think that statement kind of applied all through Worlds as well. Even in even games, or even games when you're behind against the best teams in the world, you're still creating a lot of windows to come back into the game. So
Yeah.
do you think that is a more productive thing for international competition, even if it might be less easy, I guess, for just regional?
Yeah, I think there has to be a balance. I think there really has to be a bit of both. I think when it comes to actually closing out games, I think working on mid game is for sure, I don't want to say more important, it's just it's more likely to actually translate to the win, because if you don't have a solid understanding of how the game is going to play out after like 15-20 minutes, then you're just going to get into situations where you're just skill checking the opponents. And when you play against teams that have just played 3 times as many competitive games as you're going to get skill checked a lot more than back in Europe, for example. So I think this is kind of something we see when Western teams go internationally, is no matter the game state, the game always comes down to like big 5v5 even moments where you just get outplayed at some point and you're just like, sucks. What can you do? Whereas I think if you have that solid understanding of how to actually create advantages in the mid game without relying on leads, I think you get a lot more situations where you can just cleanly close out the game without giving that window. I think, yeah, that's kind of how I'd describe that.
And one of the ways that you guys have been so good at doing that this year is how you play around the side lanes.
Yeah.
I don't know how much you can share, but if I ask you, what is your approach to how we should play around side lanes? What would you say?
So my approach of side lanes is really just, I don't want to give anything for free, and that includes like I don't want to give a team fight to a team that hasn't worked for it. Essentially, I think too many times you get into these games, especially internationally, where you kind of freeze and you kind of just go, okay, Drake is spawning, let's go. And then now you've got a 5v5, you haven't set up for it. Enemy team may or may not have. And then it's just like, okay, it's either execution or it's whichever team had set up and plays the situation better. Whereas I really don't like that. I really don't like that feeling of they just got a fair fight. I think that's the main thing I kind of preach to my team, is like, this is what they want from this game state. So we need to go back. We need to look at how we avoid that situation. So, for example, it's just thinking ahead. Okay, Drake is spawning in a minute. We don't want to contest this one. So we need to be basing a minute ahead of that even, so that we are ready on the opposite side pressuring. Whereas a lot of teams, even if they're not playing for objectives, they still base on the same timings. And then they're just not actually on the map to pressure on the window when the enemy team is vulnerable. So they don't ask any questions of the enemy team. It's just like, okay, we get this, and then we go back to playing the game normal. Where I think the main thing is to just keep asking questions. Even if it's not the most optimal thing, a lot of times we would just have Caps on side lane. He shows on a wave, and suddenly 5 people on the enemy team see him, and they're like, oh, Caps is doing the thing again. And then they start doubting, are we even supposed to be here? Does someone have to go catch that? And then they're just not focusing on the right thing. Whereas too often in Europe, teams just converge on mid lane, like 30 seconds or on spawn, and then they're just like, okay, we're just looking at each other now. Both side lanes are 5-5. Like, what do we do? Whereas my thing is just making sure we're always asking questions and make sure that if they do get a fight, it's the fight that we want to have. And it's like they're having to come to us instead of us going to them.
And you mentioned there, if we know we're not fighting for this dragon that's coming up,
Mm-hmm.
other than, well, the enemy team is really far ahead, which I think is kind of a more obvious way to see it. How do you identify what the enemy team would want and what we would want if it's just everything's equal or as equal as it should be?
Yeah, I think unfortunately part of it is metagame where you can kind of just assume every team's going to play for Drakes unless proven otherwise. I think most teams do kind of just default to like the easy decision there. But mostly it just comes down to being aware of if you want to fight yet. If your AD carry is behind or you don't have sums and you don't want to fight, then you don't have to fight unless it's like fourth Drake. Like you can just give one up to create that space on the other side. So I think it's more just being aware of like the game state, and part of it is just you can just assume teams will just navigate to Drake. It's just such an easy like I don't know what we want to do in the game, so let's just go Drake because it's spawning kind of thing.
Mm. And a good assumption, like you say, until you're proven wrong. It's like you might
Yeah.
assume that they're going to play like everyone else plays until they show you something different.
Yeah, I think that even came up this year where I think the entire year BDS was just another one of these teams that would just group mid ahead of the objective spawning and then work out what to do from there. Whereas I think when we played them in, I think it was summer playoffs, they actually started trying to send Nuke on side to push out waves, even when Drake was spawning, because you could see we weren't in position for it. So it did happen, it did evolve, but that was more they were then metagaming against us because then they assume we're just going to go on side. So it was more that rather than like solid fundamentals. But
Mm.
that does happen where sometimes a team will do something different and then you'll be like, oh, okay, now we have to react kind of thing.
Mm. And did you guys ever consider sort of doing that yourself, like coming into Worlds being a team that, of course, all the other Eastern teams will have been looking at as some of the toughest competition, and knowing that you're very strong on side lanes? Did you ever come into a
Mm.
game saying, right, this game, just fuck side lanes, we're gonna just perma group to catch them off guard, or is that kind of too risky?
I think there were a lot of games that I think we could have called to do that a lot more. I think that's something that we didn't do enough of. I think especially when we're playing like in summer when we just started locking in Ornn and we just locked in tanks for BB, it became a lot more about grouping rather than split pushing unless things had gone wrong. So it did happen for sure. For Worlds as well, there was a lot of like Nocturne Ori games where sometimes you kind of fool yourself into doing that. So it's kind of a balance. I think there will always be split pushing and there will always be playing the map wide. But I think the grouping part of it and just grouping for the sake of it has to be the exception. I think if you just do that because you're afraid of the mistakes that happen when you try and play the game, then you're kind of limiting yourself. And I think that's what we tried to avoid this year. We tried to avoid the kind of easy get out of let's just group and fight.
Mm. I love that phrase you use, like without a good reason. It's like, okay, we're going to
Yeah.
group and fight because then suddenly it's
Yeah.
a different thing because the enemy AD has no flash or because, X, Y, Z.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the most important thing. Is like as soon as you start doing things just by habit, you've got a problem. Like I think one thing that Remain really pushes for is to make everything conscious. And I think that's something that I think I picked up on this year is just making sure if there's anything we're doing just naturally, that's almost a problem. Like, okay, this is something we do naturally. You might think, okay, this is good if it's a good thing that we're doing naturally, but then you're going to go on stage and there's pressure and you're not going to do the natural thing. You're going to start overthinking things. So there needs to be that kind of conscious element to it of why you're doing it.
Yeah, I love that. I love that phrase. I think it's so useful. And in reality, a lot of the stuff we've talked about is doing that same thing, but applying it to the game. Like now when we've got words for stuff, when we can actually repeat the same thing, that is, kind of making it conscious.
Yeah.
One of the things that you talked about on Euphoria before was with how crazy the year is, and it looks
Yeah.
like it's going to get more crazy, if anything. How do you, as a coach, go about thinking of how to peak at the right time? Because of course, it's
Mhm.
not like physical sport where it's even more intensive, but we still should have peaks and troughs and building to the right moment. And yet, it's
Yeah.
something where I spoke to, example, someone who was an Olympic performance director, and he spent so much of his focus on that. Like, okay, in this tournament, we're going to try and hit top 12 because in that tournament years later, we're going to go for top 4 or, whatever it might
Yeah.
be. How do you approach that in an esports context? Or we can even just say specifically for LEC. Now, there's 3
Yeah.
international tournaments, 3 splits, all have a different layout, all have a different format. How do you go about it?
Yeah. So like this year was very tough on that. I think I I wasn't there in 2023 when they first introduced the format they used this year, but I didn't expect how tough it would be because okay, you think more competitive games are going to get more practice, but in reality, you get less practice because you have one less day of scrims per week. You also can't specify your practice as much because you play 3 different teams on a weekend, so you have to be a lot more general. And then it's just very hard having to peak so many times, especially if you, as you say, you can kind of manage that, but then if you're managing that, you're not aiming to win everything. So I think one big thing G2 had from 2023 was they lost that spring split, and that was the only split they lost. So that kind of stung. So this year, the goal was to just win everything. So this year was very tough because you had to peak constantly. Like if you go into, it's not like the old days when you had 2 splits and you had 18 games. So we were legit on G2. We were just kind of relaxing for like 6 of those weeks. We knew we get enough wins that we're going to make playoffs, and then we just have to try after that. Whereas now it's like we had a bad week in summer where we're thinking, okay, we just had what we have EWC, MSI, and then 2 splits we'd had till then. You'd think, okay, we're coming into summer, we can take a little bit of a break. So the players had less solo queue days before we came back into the split. We went 1 and 2, and suddenly we're like, okay, now we're not even guaranteed to make it out of regular season. So now everything has to start right now. So there was just like no room. Anytime you try and take a break when every game is like must win, it's a problem. So I think this season in particular was probably the hardest for that. I'm still not sure how to navigate that without not necessarily tanking a split, but more accepting that you might not win a split. And I think that's very hard to do when you expect yourself to win every game. That's a hard mental space to find when your goal is to win everything. So I think it's very hard in the current or like the last season, especially, just because if you have a bad day, suddenly you're one game away from elimination. Like summer, not summer, yeah. we lost to Mad, for example, in the first week of summer finals, and suddenly you're like, okay, we could lose, and now everything's like up in the air. There's panic zone everywhere, so it's very stressful. I'm still not sure how I would approach that, even in hindsight yet. I think that's something I'm still working at.
Yeah, it's really, really difficult. And even if you are very conscious about your intensity and we build up to the right moment, the exact right moment, there is still stuff outside of your control that might happen anyway. And then the whole year has been building up to this certain thing. I mean, one of the
Yeah.
examples in sport over the last couple of years is the two greatest cyclists in the world at the moment, or like road cyclists, Grand Tour cyclists. Over the
Mhm.
last few years, just before the Tour de France, one of them got injured. Like they just crashed and
Oh,
got
okay.
injured. And so
Yeah.
your entire year is based purely on performing for this 3 week period. And all the other
Yeah.
races you do, I mean, we pretend they're super important, but really you're doing them so that you're ready for the Tour de France. And
Yeah.
yeah, one year one of them crashed and a month before. The next year the other one crashed a month before, and both times
Yeah.
the other
Okay.
person then won. It's like
Yeah. No, I mean that kind of goes back to how things used to be when in the old two split format. It really was just okay. We don't need to be good the whole year. We just need to be good for Worlds, and that was really like, and that was easier to do. You had the space because if you have 2 or 3 bad weeks in the old regular season, that was only 6 games. If you have 2 bad weeks right now, you're 0-6 and you're just not making playoffs, or you're just out because you lost 2 best-of-3s. So it's like you have to be every week. You have to be as good as possible, and there's no space for that.
And you mentioned solo queue days there, or having, changing that amount. Are there other things
Mhm.
that you guys did experiment with in terms of how you change the intensity? As in, okay, it's still 6 scrims, but we don't do a VOD review, or we take them lighter, or we do like we do 3 scrims rather than 6, or whatever it might be. Are there ones that you found that work better, or even just the things that you've tried in terms of either increasing or decreasing the intensity based on what you need to perform?
Yeah, I think we didn't have too many spaces to really decrease the intensity. I think any time we did, it was through the time off, and then we'd come into the split very rusty, and then we'd have to then go intense again. I don't think it's really something we got necessarily the balance of perfectly. I think it was a very kind of mentally stressful year on that degree. I think that's something, yeah, I have to think about. I'm really not sure how to do that in hindsight.
Mm. I mean, I don't think anyone is, to be honest.
Yeah.
I think it's very, very, very difficult, especially again when we don't have very much control over the practice environment. You're still playing
Yeah.
another team, and if you go into if you go into this day of scrims, even with less solo queue warm ups, suddenly you losing against the people you're scrimming against, then it's more frustrating. Then and then it can be more stressful, intense day than it would have been if you'd have just been fully prepared. So,
Yeah, exactly. I think that's something that we've seen a lot where, yeah, how you practice really does impact how you then practice the next day, and it all snowballs from there.
mm. One of the things, I mean, the teams that you've worked with, well, not just from G2 this year, but especially in that the very famous, Perks and Caps roster and all that kind of thing,
Mhm.
very famous for being unbelievably creative in terms of as players. But one of the things that we see a lot with creativity is the more creative you are, the more kind of unforced errors you're going to have. It always reminds
Yeah.
me of in rugby sevens, the Fijian team are super famous for that, and they're super famous for being unbelievably creative, always going for the offload, always going for the extra pass. But they
Mhm.
also make way more unforced errors than everyone else. So,
Yeah.
as a coach for these super creative teams, how do you go about trying to find that balance? And is it just, okay, look, it's just going to be more stressful than if they're a bit more secure?
I think part of it is sometimes you just can't hold someone back. I think if you start doing that, then you're not actually getting that player, you're getting something different. And I think I came to terms with that a long time ago. I'm very much a like logic and structured kind of person. So I try and like be the balance of, okay, you can do this, but there's also a perfectly easy solution to this that you don't need to try so hard. So that's where I try and come in and be that side of things. But yeah, I think I came to terms with these guys have to go out there and do something very monotonous. So they need to be able to express themselves. I think I don't want a situation, unless it comes to like the last week of practice before finals, then you can start being like, okay, you don't need to be creative on this. Let's just take the easy win. But I think for a large part of it, it's just letting the players really express themselves, because I think otherwise you're just not getting the player that you wanted or that you needed.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic point. It's like if you almost like smooth out the edges of certain players, it's like, well, then you've just got a worse version of a more simple player. You've taken away some of their
Yeah.
spark.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that comes into how the games actually end up. Like very often you don't just win the game because of the cookie cutter, you draft team fight, you go, you team fight, you win. Like you need someone to do something different, something special. And I think if you work to instead like kind of create the space for that, which I think was a lot of what we did this year with Caps, was to really just, he likes to play a side lane. He likes, if the game isn't easy, he likes to go on side and he likes to pressure. So we then made that like the system. This is how do we create space for him to do this? Okay, what are you doing that's making this thing hard, basically? And I think that's also an important thing. I think if you have too many people being creative at once, that's when the problems really come. I think when we were at our best in like 2019-20 G2, it was because someone came up with the solution, what they want to do, and everyone followed that. The problems were where, okay, you're trying this, okay, so I'm going to try this. You end up with like Kazakh's top lane, and you end up with playing Sona and your Sona Tarot games, but then you're trying to counter Yumi with Mordekai's. You just get into the dangerous territory when you allow everyone to do it at the same time. So I think that's a very key part of it is, okay, this player is creative in this way. How do we enable that? Where you have, okay, Mickey is going to look for any angle to all in. How do we enable this? Caps is going to try and split push no matter what. How do we enable this? And I think that's like the key part of it, is also using it to be the weapon, I guess, rather than being like, okay, this didn't work and this was bad. It's more, okay, this didn't work. Can we like deconstruct it, go back? How would we have made this work in the first place?
And making it conscious again. So rather than
Yeah.
just letting it happen, let's actually be specific and start to build up that vocabulary and build up those systems.
Yeah, exactly. And then everyone knows what to do. They see Caps go and they're like, okay, now I know I need to chill. I need to just let him do his thing. He's going to pressure and then we get to play. Or for Mickey, for example, you just need to follow up. He's going to see the angle, you go. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. If it does, it does, kind of thing.
One of the things you mentioned at the beginning that used to be your role, or it might have been your role again, but talking about prepping for teams and scouting them. How do you go about doing that? Just in the most, starting from the most broad 30,000 foot version.
Yeah, I think for me, it's a lot about patterns, and it's thinking, okay, what do they have to be thinking or talking about to approach these patterns? And I think that's kind of how I go. Like I'll watch through games. I'll watch through like 5 games from like the same timestamp, like the first 5 minutes or the first clear, and then the next 5 minutes. And then I'll look at like how they set up for Drakes all in like sequence rather than watching through whole games, just to like then theory craft like, okay, if this is a pattern, how do they arrive there? What has to be happening in their team that they're arriving at this conclusion to then tell me like how they play, essentially. That's like the broad stroke of it, I guess.
Okay, so it's not just this is how they set up Dragon the last 5 times, but it's because that's what they do, what these are the things that they might value, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. I think like in North America when I was there, I think Immortals, they would just, no matter what, they would just gank bot. No matter what, every game, everything would lead to going bot. So I see a Nico locked in mid, and I'm like, okay, this guy's going to hit level 6, he's going to base, and he's going to be a cannon minion. and he's going to be in your lane. Like, it's not necessarily looking at what they did because he'd never done that before, but it's kind of thinking about how they arrived at that conclusion. And the conclusion was their bot lane was just very demanding, and they were clearly the vocal ones on the team. So if there's a tool, they're going to use it for that. And it's kind of following that process.
I love that. I think it's so useful. I think it's a stage that a lot of teams sometimes miss. It reminds me of there's this fantastic documentary about South African rugby team, which has been the best team in the world, but back-to-back World Cup winners. And they always talk when they're doing their scouting. They have all the analysts, all the stats, all the people looking at the play. But the constant question that Razzie is asking is, what's the soul of the team? Like the team that we're playing against. And so there's literally moments when they're preparing for, I think, even the World Cup final, whereas like people keep presenting to him like, here's a play that they do, here's another play that they do. But he's like, no, like we still need to find like what is their soul, like what is the thing that makes them really tick? Like you're saying here, they're always going to take things into bot lane, which is just so much more productive in a lot of ways, but most importantly, because it's more actually useful. If you give that to a player, and that's something that you can really grasp hold of. Whereas if you give them, okay, the last 5 times they set up Dragon, they did this and this with this ward pattern and stuff, it can quite easily be kind of too much.
Yeah, exactly. I think for sure it's about, just giving them kind of the space to find their own solution to these things. I think it's not very useful to just spew information at players. I think they have a lot to think about themselves, but I think more getting into like, this is how your opponent thinks, and this is why he thinks that way. This is what shows us that he thinks that way, and giving them that, because I think that tends to get more results than just they've done the same thing 5 times in a row. I think, for example, 2019, when we played against T1, it would be very easy to just show them being on Drake on spawn every minute and just be like, okay, this is what they do. They're just on Drake on spawn, all 5 of them. Do with that what you will. But instead, like, I worked out, okay, they do the structure. They're going to base 1 minute before. They're going to be in bot river looking to fight for that minute before. Like, Faker's not even there yet, but they're already looking to fight because they know they're going to have man advantage eventually, so they will win. It's not necessarily going to be a clean fight, but they know eventually Faker will arrive first and he'll win that fight. So then we had to change how we approached. Instead of just looking at the fact that they were there on 5 minutes, on Drake spawn every 5 minutes, it was more, okay, this whole minute beforehand, we need to be thinking about. We need to change how we play. And then the whole minute before that, we need to think about how we play to prepare for that situation. So it's more about, like how they arrive where they're going is more important, I think.
And have there been teams in the past that have been more difficult to find these patterns, or I guess teams that have been inconsistent with how they approach things, or inconsistent with how they think about things, so it's harder to identify this is what they really value because they're not doing the same every game, even on a deep level?
Yeah, I think generally that comes to losing teams. I think when you play against losing teams, it's a lot more dangerous to look into what they're thinking, because often they're second guessing themselves more than anything, and they're going to come out with different approaches and different games. So I try to stay away from that kind of thing. Then I will probably go for like, okay, their indecision leads to this situation often. So this is where it gets a bit more like concrete of they're just going to play for this rather than how they're thinking. Because I think, it can be dangerous if they're not sure what they're thinking about. I don't want to be the one trying to work it out.
Yeah, if you don't know what you're going to do next, the opponent's never going to know.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Sometimes that can be an advantage.
Okay. They have a problem second guessing. It's a very nice way to say it. I like that. So that's the kind of general approach I think is super useful of, okay, we're trying to find out why they're doing and how they're thinking rather than what they're specifically doing. But how do you go about that then in a more practical point of view? If there's people listening to this who are maybe even just this split, you've been given the role of scouting and someone's never done it before. So is it, you mentioned some specific timers? Is it like, okay, I'm always going to look at how they're going to do dragon, how they're going to do grubs, how they're going to do team fights? Or does that flex depending on the team? Or how do you go about the practicalities of finding this way of thinking?
Yeah, I think it flexes depending on the team, and it also flexes on depending on my team and what we're working on. A lot of times when I've been like mainly focused on scouting, like in 2019-20, it was like my presentation would be at the start of the week, and we'd practice towards the team where we're playing. So it needs to be stuff that like we can work on through the week. So that kind of decides what I want to look at. If we are going to be looking at drakes anyway, my scouting will be focused on drakes. If we're talking about like early game and pathing, then my scouting will be focused there. But generally, like the process is just generally looking at like segmented parts of the game. So for example, when you had the two heralds, the game is very clearly cut into like 2 to 8 minutes, 8 to 14, and then 14 to 20 is like 6-minute chunks of the game. So I would just watch each 6-minute chunk in sequence rather than the thrill game. And then any patterns that approached from there would be more like the specific way of doing it.
And do you do your scouting kind of primarily for the coach, primarily for the players, or a bit of both? Or
I did start primarily for the coach. I think I started scouting just like no one asked me to. It was just I noticed some things in games, so I started putting words to them and giving them to the coach. And then as time progressed, it became more towards the players. I think now if I do scouting, like for this year, Rodrigo and Click were the main in charge of scouting, but so I moved my sort of scouting into like the realms I was working on with the players already. So we would talk about the mid game macro and like how we need to adjust our approach. So it's all very fluid, I guess, but more so the players now that I'm more focused on coaching.
okay, so we've covered a lot of different areas, and as I mentioned at the beginning, you've also covered a lot of areas yourself in the different roles that you've done.
Yeah.
If I was to ask, what do you think is the area that we're currently weakest at the moment in Western League of Legends? What is it that you'd say?
The easy answer would be how we play mid game. I think the mid game sort of coaching, I think we've, as a region, kind of devolved into playing a very safe and a very like set piece style of League of Legends where teams are going to do the same thing no matter what every game without fail. You've got Mad Lions and you've got Fnatic who are just they're gonna if they have tempo they're gonna push it aside and then group and fight on the other side, or if they don't have tempo they're just gonna kill the wave and then they're gonna group and fight. So it's like that eliminates all of the mistakes that happen when you try and play 1-3-1 properly. And I feel like that's kind of the state of where we've gotten as a region, where we just play to eliminate the mistakes that happen when you're like trying to play the map wide. And I think that's where we're kind of lacking right now. I think I could have done half of the work I was doing this year and we would have still ultimately won, because the way we actually won a lot of those games was just counter stratting what they were going to do, because we knew exactly what they were going to do. I could show them in every replay, this is when the decision point is, and then we go and we play that team, and it happens, and we just do that. So I think the variety in what we do in Europe is lacking. I think it's every team has their approach to macro, but it's all very set piece. It's okay, you die too much on side, so we're going to do this. Okay, every time I'm on side, our support and jungle ends it, so we're going to do this. Whereas I think that makes sense in like ERLs where you're kind of just trying to play a game where the less mistakes you will just tend to win. Whereas when it comes to LAC and you're playing against players who are just either far better or teams that are far better, you need to have more variety, because if you do the same thing, you're just going to get caught out by the same problems every time.
And this is obviously an impossible question, but just to speculate on, why do you think that it is that we've got ourselves into that kind of mess where the focus is almost more about not making mistakes rather than actually winning the game or being proactive
Um,
around it?
I think it's comes down to teams being very. I mean, teams have to win, right? I think in ERLs it makes sense. You're just learning like the structures of the game. You don't have time to like really go deep into everything, so you try and find your one way of winning. But I think then those players and those staff move up, and then they try and do the same thing. Sometimes with the same players, which makes sense, but that's not what's going to beat better teams because those teams can see what's happening. They're not trying to do the same thing, and you need to adjust. So I think that's kind of how we've arrived here. I think there's also just a kind of, I would suspect Mad Lions winning in 2021 against us as well was a part of it, where a lot of these things come from that era of just cancelling out one side and going 5 onto the other side and fighting, because we got caught out by it a lot. So it looked very effective, and it looked like it was like a counter strat to playing 1-3-1 and playing side lanes. But in reality, we just didn't have, we just weren't in the right shape. We didn't have trust in what we were doing at that time, and we just made the same mistakes over and over. So they got rewarded. And I think part of that is those players that found success doing that kind of kept doing that and kept holding on to that as like, this must be how we win because we beat G2 kind of thing. That's just speculation. I don't know for sure, but that's how it feels
Mm.
from kind of the G2 side of things.
Yeah. And then I guess one of the other things is that I'm trying to think of the nice way to say this. A lot of the knowledge is like collated in the same area. If you look at
Yeah.
the G2 team from before, it's like the people are either on G2 or not playing. So that's not like
Yeah.
it's spread out. I mean, now this coming into the next year, maybe it's with a few spreading to other places, maybe we start to see some other teams adopting these kind of concepts. But it can be quite, I wouldn't say impenetrable, but it can be much harder to kind of see it from the outside than when you've already got that language and you've got those things that you're talking about, like we've been discussing.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I don't think I've really talked too much with other people about like how I see the game. I've talked mostly about that with my players, right? So it makes sense that necessarily that knowledge doesn't transfer very far, and they're just going off of what they see, or like they're going off the results if they're trying to copy or not. So that makes sense.
One of the last things I want to get to before we move on to the quickfire questions, you talked at the beginning about democratic or dictatorial approach, or it's one of these things where I find the first way that you heard it described is the terminology that you like. So the one that I always default to is vertical and horizontal.
Okay.
But as someone who likes that more democratic style of coaching, what are some of the things that you do to kind of get the most out of that? If someone's listening to this and either that's already the kind of person they are, or potentially they're more in the middle, or potentially even they're more on the dictatorial side, but they're like, look, I really want to learn some things on that side of things. What are the tools that you've found the most effective in that area?
Um. So most of this is like, I don't know. It's like stuff that comes natural to me. It's not stuff I put too much thought into, but it's more the effect of just me as a person. I think being very soft spoken and not trying to take up too much space, I think is very important if you want to be kind of democratic. Because if you're someone who's constantly likes to interrupt and be a loud person in the room, it's just not going to have the same effect. Because when I speak, it tends to be that people will quieten down to hear what I have to say, rather than me being someone who's just constantly interrupting everyone anyway. They're just going to fight back and go like that. So I think that's not necessarily a conscious tool I had, but it's something I'm more conscious of now, where, yeah, I'm not the guy that's speaking all the time, but it tends to be when I speak, people give me the space to speak. So I think that's probably my advice would be to not be the loudest person in the room if you want to be kind of a more democratic approach. I think it's also, again, setting expectations. Like I came in to G2 and I was like, okay, to start with, I'm not going to be the guy that's going to have 20 points at the end of every review. I'm going to really think about what's happening. I'm going to come the next day with the majority of my work, like what we need to work on. So there was kind of that expectation that like we're going to work together on this. It's not like, okay, you played this game, there's 20 things you did wrong. Do them better next time. It's going to be more of a like slow process and really making sure everyone understands that. And I think probably that would be the main thing, is setting the expectation. If you want to coach that way, you need to set that expectation and you need to be consistent with that. You can't be like, yeah, we're gonna be friends and we're gonna talk about these things, and then someone does something you don't like and you're like, yo, never again, and start throwing toys at the pram sort of thing. I think it's just consistency on that part.
I think it's such fantastic advice. I think expectations, I mean, at all levels, but especially in ERL when people are changing so frequently and you might be coaching a team for a couple of months, or great if you get a whole year. But setting those expectations, I think, is so important, because you can waste half the year of people gradually getting to know how you are as a coach, because they might assume that all coaches are like their previous coach and want to do it in a certain way.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a huge part, because everyone has their own preconceptions of what their coach is and what works for them and doesn't. And I think sometimes you do just have to be honest and be like, this is how I'm going to work. So don't, like, of course, if I'm doing nothing, then sure, you can call me out. But if I'm quiet, there's a reason. This is how I work, sort of thing. And also part of that is also the space that's afforded by my experience. I think if I was just a complete nobody, like I had no experience and I'm just like, okay, I'm going to be quiet for 3 days and say nothing, like obviously that's not going to fly. I think sometimes you do have to push yourself a bit to start with, but you do have to settle into being yourself, because if you're just putting on an act, I think that really shows to people if you can't like maintain that act 24/7.
I think that thing of silence is so powerful as well. Just giving people the space to express themselves, and even when you kind of think they're done, give them a little bit, give them a little bit more. Just give them your attention and give them your time. I think it's such good advice. There's a. It took me far too long to learn this, really, but when I was studying, I was doing kind of esports on the side, but I was studying filmmaking, and I spent a lot of time doing documentary filmmaking. And I realized, like I say, I took too long to bring this into coaching for sure. But what tends to happen on a documentary is you set up all the cameras, you ask your questions, and then the person gives their answer to the question, and then there's a little pause, and then they start talking again.
Yeah.
And invariably, the stuff that actually goes in the movie is the stuff that's after the pause, not before
Yeah.
the
Okay.
pause.
Yeah. When they've actually had time to really process where they are. Yeah. That makes sense.
Okay, fantastic. Like I say, I want to take us to the quickfire questions, which is the same that I ask everybody. I think it's so interesting that we come to this from so completely different areas and different fields. So I'm asking everyone the same questions. When I say quickfire, you don't have to answer quickly. I'm just going to try not to ask follow-ups, even if I think of them. That's really what I mean. It's me needing to be quick, not you.
Okay.
So the first one is, who are the coaches that you look up to or idolize, either now or early on in your career?
So I guess I've been very lucky and I've kind of worked with them all now. I think, yeah, I've worked with some of the best coaches like Europe and the West have seen. I've worked with Mithy, I've worked with Youngbuck, I've worked with Grabs and Dylan now. I think it's really, yeah, I've been quite fortunate in that. I think the coach that really, the shame is, I don't know what happens in Korea, because I think the coach that really still makes me feel like a kid is Koma. I think just, I can see Faker, I can see all of these guys walking around, and it's all very normal to me. But anytime I see Koma walking around, I still feel like that shy little esports guy who's just come in and it's like, oh my God, it's Coma. There he is. I think he's the coach that really, I don't know, stands out. I think in terms of like actual in-game, I'm not sure how much of BLG comes from, like BLG 2023 came from players or coaches. I've seen enough of Absolute Legends this year that I'm pretty sure Tabby at least has carried on that same sort of way of playing. But I think wherever that kind of, I don't know, thought process and play style comes from, I kind of idolize that because I think, again, we've seen a lot of it in BOG at the start of this year as well, where it's just that play style I kind of, I guess, look up to rather than necessarily a specific coach. It's just that play style and who that comes from is what I look to.
What's the biggest hardship that you've ever experienced as a coach?
As a coach, I think just in terms of League of Legends in general, I think in what was this? This was 2018 with the Hjarnar Medid Perks Jankos Wonder roster. We had a couple weeks where we went something like 2-21 in scrims. I think it was even more extreme than that. I think we maybe won one game in an entire 2 weeks of scrims, and then we just lost 0-3 in playoffs. I think coming back from that was probably the hardest point because, yeah, everyone was just a little bit lost. We kind of just, rather than force things, we just took like an extra week break and just let everyone go their ways. And I think during that week, it was just like the whole thing was just sleepless nights, like trying to like work out what's going wrong, like how can we lose this many games. I think that was probably the hardest to come back from, but I think how we handled it was pretty good, just taking a break rather than just being like, okay, we're going to play until we're good kind of thing. I don't think that ever really works. I think that was probably the hardest. I'd say also in terms of more recently, in terms of more direct coaching, it would be 2019 when we had our boot camp in London, which was a rough experience, but we were just like, we were under the impression teams would come to Europe to practice, like to boot camp ahead of Worlds, but of course all the Asian teams just stayed in Asia until the last minute. So we were just scrimming against NA teams. So we were just winning every game. It was really easy. And then Dam1 arrives and we have like 3 days booked with them. I think again, we go like 1 win, 21 losses or something. And that's really, again, it's when you start to really doubt everything you've been doing. Like this team has just come off a plane after 14 hours. They're dealing with jet lag and they're just slapping us about. So I think those are probably the like 2 hardest, like professional points.
And what's your top highlight in your career?
Highlight. I'd say probably the first LEC title, I think in 2016. I was remote at the time, but I kicked my parents out of the living room. I got the big TV and I set up my computer and I just watched the finals. G2 in their first finals, first year in LEC, first split. That was probably the highlight. Just sitting there. Like I'm not someone who gets like very animated and like hyped and woo, let's go. But that day I was like, that was probably the most roller coaster I've been on because that was when, oh, we can actually win, became a reality.
And what are 3 non-negotiable behaviors that you and people around you need to buy into?
I think so. I guess first you have to coach yourself. I think I've seen it both sides where I think ultimately this is like it's a performance-based industry, but it's also like a passion-based industry. If you're here and you're waiting for someone to tell you how to improve or how to get better or what you did wrong, I think you're just not going to survive. Like no one can have talent if they're not willing to like actually be the main character of that talent. And I think that's probably one thing I also need because I'm not a motivator. I'm not a guy that's going to push you. I'm going to be like, approached from a logical side. So I think I need that if I'm going to work with someone. I need someone who is willing to coach themselves and wants to get the most out of this. I think you also have to, I think respect is a big one. As I say, I'm a very soft-spoken person. If someone's going to just constantly interrupt and speak over and shout, and like, I'm not going to be able to match that energy, so it just won't work. I really need, not just towards me, but just within the group, I need a very big level of respect. I just need that. And then third would be honesty. And I don't mean just like not lying. I think everyone just trying to do their honest best to win and do it in like a good way. I don't like examples where they'll see a problem, they'll give up on the source of that problem. They'll give up on a player, or they'll think, oh, he's never going to change, or he's not going to listen. So they go to someone else, tell them something to kind of fix that problem. Be like, okay, this is a problem. You need to take responsibility and you need to talk more. You need to do stuff. But which is a way of solving it. But I don't like when that's done without the other person being involved, because then you get the situation where they're talking the same amount, the other person's talking more, and then it just becomes a battle for no reason. I think that's like probably the most important thing. I think everyone needs to be honestly moving in the same direction. I don't like games. I don't like people who aren't upfront with what they think, and I think that's just very important for me.
And the last question, if you from today could give yourself one piece of advice when you first started your career, what would it be and why?
It would be, I guess, listen to the voice in your head. I think I've gotten by pretty well. Just when things don't feel right, then there's a reason they don't feel right, and really listen to that and think about that. I think that's probably the biggest advice. I think not doing something you're not comfortable with, not in like a push yourself out of your comfort zone kind of thing. Just like if something is genuinely asking too much of you and really think about why that is and try and work around that. I think too often I'm too slow to ask for help with things, so I tend to just take all the responsibility myself. So I think really listen to the voice, and when that voice comes in, you ask for help would be the main thing.
It's absolutely fantastic. Well, Duffman, thanks so much for coming on. That was
No
really,
problem.
really great. I loved it. Yeah, and best of luck for what you're doing in the future.
Oh, thank you. It was very fun. It's the first time I've really talked about like coaching and like my view on things, so it was a lot of fun. Thank you.